Good morning, good afternoon, and in some cases, good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Tcherchian. I'm the Chief Product Officer and Chief Information Security Officer at XYPRO Technology. And this morning, or this afternoon, we're going to be talking about how to protect your workforce with multi-factor authentication. Now, this is one of those things that has really come to light over the last few weeks because of the COVID situation. We all know that we've got to be protecting every authentication entry point with multi-factor authentication. We see it all the time. We hear about it all the time. Compliance requires it. It's just good security hygiene. Yet you'll be surprised how many people out there don't use multi-factor authentication, even though it's available and presented to them, and then functionality is there. It's just a matter of turning it on and utilizing it. So a little bit about XYPRO. We're based in Simi Valley, California, just outside of Los Angeles. Where we've been in the nonstop cybersecurity space for quite a while, over 30 years now. We've partnered very, very closely with HPE. A couple of our products actually ship as part of the operating system, which we'll discuss in a couple of minutes. We've got sales and support offices all over the world, so we're able to support every time zone. Since our customers are geographically dispersed, that gives a really, really strong advantage to them. Some recent partnerships we've set up in the cybersecurity space. Obviously, HPE being our biggest partner, as our products come as part of the Guardian operating system for nonstop. But we've had some new recent partnerships as well with SailPoint, who's the market leader in identity and access management solutions, and CyberArk, who's the market leader in privilege access management solutions. As well as RSA, which we'll be talking about our integration with RSA as part of this presentation. So let's just jump into it. Because of this new normal that we keep hearing about now, companies' entire workforces are entirely remote now. We're seeing an upward trend in cybersecurity threats, and mainly phishing attacks, meaning as criminals are taking advantage of the chaos and the panic and the uncertainty of everybody now having to transition to working from home to target that remote workforce. So we've seen a strong uptick in phishing attempts, for example. And these are targeting credentials for the most part. So you're getting emails as if it's something from your HR department communicating about the COVID situation. Or in the US, we're seeing a lot of emails being sent out targeting stimulus checks, for example, or other types of official government agencies like the World Health Organization or the IRS or other government agency, or appearing to be government agencies targeting the remote workforce. This is a really interesting article from CNBC talking about the uptick in phishing scams, or the increase in phishing scams. And this was a survey of several or quite a few cybersecurity leaders or technology leaders with large companies that they're responsible for, talking about over a third of them surveyed as part of this report have seen their risk increase. The level of hacking risk is likely much higher than that 1/3. And about 85% of companies surveyed said at least 50% of their employees are now remote. And in most cases, the companies that we're working with at least are 100% remote. So you're having a workforce that has probably in some cases never been used to working outside of office walls, now having to work from home, losing the cover of everything the office environment provides. Our IT systems, our security systems, our intrusion detection systems are now kind of disappearing now that everybody's working from home. Whether you're using a company laptop or a personal laptop, those complexities come into play. Kids being homeschooled now come into play because you're having to juggle between work and having your kids have to use computers, and in some cases you're sharing the same computer, which is exposing some people to more risk. So it's a lot of chaos, a lot of uncertainty, and in some cases that uncertainty is leading to mistakes being made. So phishing is an attack vector. Why is this so critical? Well, phishing has always been around, and we've all been through the security awareness trainings where they're telling us not to click on certain links, don't open up attachments, don't open up emails from senders that you don't realize. But this is still happening, and the volume and velocity of these phishing attacks are increasing. Why? Because phishing is relatively easy to execute. It's inexpensive. It doesn't cost the attacker a whole lot to run through this process. And obviously, they're gaining success from it. That's why they keep at it. It's interesting because I can go on to the dark web right now. And if you're not familiar with the dark web, we hear about this all the time. What's the dark web? What's the dark web? It's an entire section of the internet that's not available to most people. And when I say it's not available to most people, you can't just open up Chrome or Firefox or Edge and type in a URL and pull up a dark web website. It doesn't work that way. Those websites are blocked and you won't be able to find them. You've got to use special browsers. You've got to use special access. You've got to use special URLs and identifiers to get into that. But once you get in there, it's the types of things you can gain access to is mind-boggling. For example, you can buy a list of 1 million email addresses, validated email addresses, for about the cost of a single Bitcoin. So think about it. You're spending about $7.5 grand to $8 grand to buy 1 million email addresses. Then you take those 1 million email addresses and you target them. You start sending them phishing emails. Even if that attacker got a 1% return on those phishing attacks, it makes for a very, very lucrative business for them. So this is why they're keeping at it. And again, talking about the COVID situation and the remote workforce, now everybody working from home, gives them a bigger opportunity to target these people in terms of what's going on and how to keep up with it. Interestingly enough, we've all, like I mentioned, we've all been through the security awareness trainings. We've all seen the videos. We've all viewed the posters and the messages, and we get the emails from our IT staff and our security staff, what not to do, what not to click on, don't open up attachments. Yet 26% of recipients, as part of an exercise that was done last year by IBM, clicked on malicious emails that were sent to them. So over one fourth of the recipients actually took an action, meaning they opened up an attachment, they clicked on a link, went to a malicious website, put in their credentials in a lot of cases, or opened up an executable or some other activity that they're not supposed to do. So it's 2020. We've had all of this awareness thrown at us, yet this is still the reality. Is people are still clicking on links. It's still causing a lot of pain for a lot of cybersecurity staff. This really boils down to security best practices are not being followed. So hackers are looking to walk in through the front door. When we talk about hackers and attackers and somebody with malicious intent, it's not necessarily what you would see in the movie where they're sitting in front of 20 computer screens with source code flying by and your computer making interesting sounds that you've never heard before to play up the dramatic effect of what the hacker is doing. That's not what hacking is. Ultimately, if I can get the keys to your front door, why would I do anything else? Why would I exert any other effort to do anything else that's much harder? So your username and password are the keys to your front door. So if a hacker can compromise or capture your username and password, they'll walk in right through the front door and they don't have to do anything different. And what makes it so easy for them is people are using insecure passwords still. Again, it's 2020. We're still using passwords like password1 or things that are easily guessable. Or we're storing passwords in password files on our desktop called password.xls or password.txt. This makes it very, very easy for an attacker to capture those credentials and do what they want with it. So this is where the real challenge lies, is for somebody who's responsible for cybersecurity, we've got to be right every single time. The attacker only has to be right once. Now, we were talking about that list of 1 million email addresses that they could target, and even if they got 1% return, that's still quite a few email addresses. if they got 1/10 of 1% return, think about it. That's still a large volume of people that are responding to that phishing attempt. So that's what I mean by we've got to be right every single time. The one time we slip up is the one time that could impact millions of accounts, dollars, you name it. So talking about the current state of cybersecurity, it's currently 2020, and on average, the mean time to identify a security breach right now is 7 months. That means someone's in your network, on your systems, doing things that you don't know that they're doing, or you don't necessarily want them to be doing, and they're in there for 7 months before they're detected. It takes an additional 4 months to control that breach. So on average, the entire time they're spending on your systems, in your network, in your environment, is almost a year before they're detected and kicked out. Think about how much damage is going to be done in that span. On the higher end of the spectrum, we've got companies that have been breached for 3 years, 4 years before they get detected. Think about, before they detect the breach, think about the Marriott breach that was revealed in 2018. As they started doing the forensic work for that breach and trying to figure out how they got in, when they got in, what the activity looked like, there were records of infiltration of their network going back to 2014. They were breached for almost 4 years before they realized they'd been breached. At an average cost of almost $4 million per incident. So that number just keeps going higher and higher and higher. And the challenge here is adding more security solutions, adding the newest, coolest, analytics tool or this or that might not necessarily give you the big return on investment that you're looking for. Sometimes it really boils down to doing the basics when it comes to setting up and hardening your baseline, your environment. So making sure you've got good password hygiene, making sure you're using multi-factor authentication. These types of things will give you immediate value. A rather new type of method that attackers are using is called credential stuffing. So you may not have heard about this yet, but if you haven't, you will. This is a very interesting one. We've all seen the mega breaches and the reports on them where Yahoo got breached and Facebook got breached and all these large companies got breached and millions of records are out there in the wild. Yes, they are out in the wild. They're on the dark web. I can guarantee you my information is there as well. So all these data breaches end up in the dark web for people to go on there, purchase these lists and do what they want with it. One of the tactics that's being used is a tactic called credential stuffing. So what will happen is company will get breached. They'll take a list of these credentials and attackers know for the most part, we all use bad passwords. We use the same passwords to multiple websites. That's what's syncing a lot of this. That's what's making this method so easy. So if I take, for example, a list compromised from Yahoo, and I go and I'll try that same set of credentials, that same username password combination in multiple websites. I'll try it for a banking website, I'll try it for a utility website, I'll try it for the IRS website, you name it. And I'll just keep trying that same set of credentials or a variation of the password. And at some point, some of those websites are going to let me in because the user who was using their password for Yahoo was using that exact same password for other websites. This is where the human error comes into play. So we use passwords because we need to be able to remember them. But for us to remember them, they've got to be easy. They've got to be, for example, our kids' birthdays or some date we're going to remember, or a phrase, a word we're going to remember. Or I know sometimes you've got password controls where it requires you to change your password every 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, what have you. What do most people do? They just increment a number at the end of the password. So that's not really good password management. So attackers know this. They know you're using the same passwords across multiple sites. You're probably using the same password for your work system as you are for some of your home websites or personal websites, those types of things. So just making sure that you've got a way to manage separate passwords for every separate website you log into is good practice. But that introduces new challenges, different challenges. Sticking with the theme of talking about credential stuffing, let's just go on and on. These are all companies that have been victim of credential stuffing attacks. So we see a lot of well-known companies here. Slack, for example. Every company I know now is using Slack, and they were a victim of this at one point. Dunkin' Donuts, TripAdvisor, YouTube, you name it, it just keeps going on and on. So a few more eye-opening stats when it comes to passwords and the vulnerabilities that come along with them. So half of the respondents as part of this Centrify survey, we're not using a password vault. So again, going back to my example of a text file on your desktop that says password.txt, that's not a password vault, that's not password management. Similarly, I've seen a lot of users use an Excel file and store it either on their desktop or on a thumb drive or somewhere that has all of their passwords. And I'll say, why are you doing that? And the response will be, well, it's password protected. So the Excel file is password protected. You'd be surprised in some cases, especially with the older versions of Excel, how easy it is to crack that password. So with a little bit of computing power on AWS, I can run through a variation of most passwords. Once I lift that password file off your desktop and put it on my AWS instance, I can probably crack that password to get into your, quote unquote vault relatively easily. 65% of participants in this survey are still sharing privileged user accounts. So this is the root password, this is your admin password, this is your super password. I'm sure everybody who's sharing passwords has good justification of why these passwords need to be shared, why the same user account and password needs to be shared across multiple users. But again, it's 2020, the risks are too big or too great not to share passwords. Excuse me. So everybody who requires administrator or privilege access needs to have their own account. It's just, it allows for traceability. It allows you to remediate or capture or lock down an account if you suspect compromise without affecting anything else. But on the flip side of that, if you're sharing passwords, you don't know who did what. It becomes very, very difficult because then you've got to go and do forensic tracing to figure out what IP address, for example, came. What was the time of day that this shared account was accessed? So getting away from that type of methodology where everybody trusts everybody is no longer the case. And then the last statistic here, talking about the usage of multi-factor authentication, I was quite surprised by. So it's talking about 1 out of 5 have still not implemented multi-factor authentication. And I think that number is low. I think it's much more than that have not implemented multi-factor authentication. In some cases, I'll talk to people and their eyes will glaze over when I start talking about multi-factor authentication, as it's a brand new concept I'm introducing to them. Think about everything in your life. And I'm not just talking about your professional life, but your personal life as well. Everything that can be multi-factor authenticated or protected with multi-factor authentication should. I've got IoT devices all over my house. I've got smart devices all over my house. I can control my lights. I can control my thermostat. I can control my Roomba, little vacuum robot, all from my phone. All of those right now are protected with a username and password. Some of those devices or some of those manufacturers of those devices have started implementing multi-factor authentication. That means if somebody were to compromise, let's say my Nest account, they can't just log in online and start adjusting the thermostat in my house from halfway around the world. I want to protect against that. So Nest does have two-factor authentication, but some of my other devices don't. And I'm getting to the point where I'm considering, do I replace these devices? Yes, it will cost a significant amount of money. Do I replace these devices with ones that do provide multi-factor authentication? Another good example is your iCloud account, your Apple account. If you use a Mac or an iPhone or any other Apple device, you're required to have an iCloud account. Well, you're not required, but to take full advantage of the ecosystem, you should have an iCloud account, which 99% of people with Apple devices do have that. we've probably all heard about these celebrity hacks over the last few years, where somebody logged into their iCloud account and was able to get access to personal photos that they didn't realize were syncing from their phone to the cloud. Well, Apple does offer multi-factor authentication. In fact, they offer very strong multi-factor authentication, where you've got to validate that on multiple devices in some cases before it'll let you on. If this part of your personal life is that important, you better look into multi-factor authentication, turning it on everywhere you can. So let's talk about multi-factor authentication. What is it? So we've traditionally relied on username and password to authenticate ourselves to our system. So a username and password is something we know. We are assigned a username, we're given a password, we remember our password, we sit in front of a computer, we log in, and boom, we're on a desktop, we can perform our day-to-day work activities. If that password was ever compromised or stolen or guessed, anybody else can log into that system and pretend they're me and start using and having access to the things that I have access to. What multi-factor authentication does is a username and password alone is no longer good enough. You've got to present a second factor to authenticate yourself, to say, yes, this is really me. So that can be in terms of biometrics, something you are. It can be a fingerprint, it can be a retina scan, it can be Face ID, facial recognition. Unfortunately, though, Face ID isn't working so well anymore, considering everybody has to wear masks. I was at a grocery store a couple of weeks ago with my mask on, and I was trying to pay with Apple Pay, and I was going, you know, why won't this work? Why won't this work? And the cashier had to go, well, you've got a mask on. I was like, really? He's like, yeah, you know what? Take a picture with your mask on and have that recognized as one of the fingerprints for your Face ID. And sure enough, that did work. So now even with my mask on, my Face ID works. But it also shows you all the strides we've made with all the facial recognition technology, that something like this, a bug that we can't see, kind of brings that whole thing down. But in any event, something you are, biometrics, fingerprint, facial recognition is that second factor. Or in most cases, the most common case is something you have. This can be a token, a hard token, a soft token, a smart card. I'm sure we've all seen the RSA Secure ID tokens that people have on their key rings. This is that second factor I'm talking about. So the way this would all work together is you sit in front of a system that's protected with multi-factor authentication. You present a username and password, something you know, and then you'd provide a PIN from that token. That's something you have. If you don't have that token, you won't have that PIN. And that PIN in most cases will rotate every 30 seconds, 60 seconds. So even if your username and password were stolen, unless the attacker had that token along with your username and password to know what your PIN was at that moment in time, the username and password is useless to them. In most cases, multi-factor authentication is a requirement for regulatory compliance. PCI DSS requires it. There's a couple of requirements in PCI DSS that state multi-factor authentication needs to be applied. So anybody with non-console administrative access to the card data environment needs to have that protected with multi-factor authentication. Previously, PCI DSS stated that you just needed MFA or multi-factor at the VPN. So if you were remote, just logging into the network, if the network was protected with multi-factor authentication, then that was good enough. But they started realizing the flaws in that is once you get onto the network, you can pivot around into the card data environment, outside of the card data environment, and that's still a risk. So what they did is they tightened the grip around what they considered needing protection with MFA. And they put the latest PCI 3.2, PCI DSS 3.2 requires MFA at the card data environment. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing that requirement get pushed closer and closer to the device itself. So the endpoint that you're trying to connect to now needs to be protected with MFA, not just the perimeter network. NIST 800-171 also requires MFA, and a lot of other compliance frameworks are based on missed 800.171. So for example, DFARS, if you're in the government sector, in some cases you're going to have to comply with DFARS. DFARS explicitly states you need to comply with 800.171. GDPR, even though it doesn't explicitly state multi-factor authentication, all the language is there to make sure that you're doing everything you're supposed to be doing to protect the data that you have. And it's 2020. I don't know how you can interpret that anything other than I've got to have multi-factor authentication turned on. But that doesn't mean we can relax on our passwords either. We still can't use, or we still shouldn't be using password 1 as a password, or let me in, or our spouses or kids' birthdays as a password. I would say always use a passphrase, and a passphrase doesn't have to be uppercase, lowercase, letters and numbers and all kinds of interesting symbols. That's not a passphrase. A passphrase is only a phrase that you're going to remember. This can be a song lyric. This can be a quote out of a book. This can be a quote from your grandfather. It can be you looking out the window of your house and saying, I see a red rose, I see a green tree, and I see a bird. That combination together is a passphrase that you'll probably remember. It's going to be much, much, much easier to remember than something like uppercase A, lowercase c, £, exclamation mark. Nobody's going to remember that. But a passphrase will also be hard to guess, impossible to guess with a brute force attack or a password guessing program or those types of algorithms that exist, because the string will be so long. It would take the computing power doesn't exist to run through all of the combinations. We talked about something you are. Again, these are fingerprints, these are iris scans, these are facial recognitions. This is that second factor. So you put in your username and password, and then you're you. So that'll provide the second factor. The attacker who's got your username and password is not you. So their biometric data will not match. And then again, tokens being the most common factor of two-factor authentication, or that second factor for two-factor authentication. This is, again, your RSA token or your soft token on your phone that rotates every 30 seconds. Interestingly enough, there's this concept of three-factor authentication now that's being discussed. There are flaws in two-factor authentication. I don't know, well, they're not big enough to say, I'm not going to use it because it can be hacked. That's a ridiculous statement. It's the best level of protection that you can apply to your digital life right now. Unfortunately, yes, at some point in the future, somebody's going to figure out a way how to compromise it and get around it. But we're still in a comfortable place where this is going to be better than not using it. So let's talk about how we can apply multi-factor authentication to your NonStop servers, and then how that applies to your applications running on your NonStop servers as well. So XYGATE User Authentication comes as part of the HPE NonStop operating system. It's embedded, it extends Safeguard's capabilities. Safeguard is the NonStop security subsystem. So XUA will extend Safeguard's capabilities. Nothing to buy, I'm not selling you anything. You already have this. If you've got a NonStop server, you've already got XUA. You've got the full capabilities. All you've got to do is turn it on and start using it. So this is the HPE supported de facto solution for multi-factor authentication for your NonStop and for Active Directory integration. This also provides single sign-on capabilities. So you can use your same credentials you use to log into your Windows server, for example, or your Active Directory. You can use those exact same credentials to log into your NonStop once the two are integrated together. RSA Secure ID, again, out of the box, just turn it on, configure it, and you've got 2FA or MFA turned on right away. Last year, we certified this solution with RSA's Cloud Authentication Service, but it doesn't have to stop there. If you've got Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticate or another third-party authentication provider, we can integrate with those as well. The key here is it'll give you multi-factor authentication. It gives you all types of granular authentication controls as well. So you can restrict who's logging into your systems and applications by IP address. You can restrict the ports they're coming into. You can apply time-based controls. For example, certain users can only log in during these times or during these days or even these weeks of the month. We've got controls for requesting programs and ancestor programs. We can treat aliases and user IDs differently, so you can apply different controls to each one. Again, we talked about integrating with LDAP and RSA and Radius and any other third-party provider you would like for MFA and single sign-on. And this is just the tip of the iceberg as far as the granularity of the controls XUA offers. This is an entire manual of giving you all types of flexibility of how you want to configure this for your environment. So the newest feature of XUA, which is available this year, is integration with your multi-factor integration with your NonStop application. Previously, XUA worked with your Guardian users, so you're logging onto your system and protecting that part of it. But your applications are also in scope. So for example, if you got base 24, or if you've got a custom application, or other legacy applications that might not have the libraries or the functionality to provide multi-factor authentication, XUA can now be integrated into your application, and you would have the same multi-factor experience as you're used to logging into your NonStop. For example, you log into base 24, you get your base 24 screen, you put in your username and password. With this integration, as soon as you put in your username and password, you would get prompted on a second screen to provide your RSA token. Once you put in your RSA token and that's validated, then you can log into base 24. Now, this will answer a lot of the questions auditors have about, now, is my application in scope or it's not? Well, you don't have to worry now because your application is protected with this. And again, you've got everything out of the box. So there's nothing to sell here. There's nothing to pitch here. You've already got everything we're talking about. You've got a NonStop server. You've got XUA. So, and all the scripts and all the utilities you need to turn it on, configure it, and start using it. So it's very easy to do. You just need a few pieces of information from your RSA server on how to configure it, who XUA needs to talk to as far as IP addresses, ports, and other types of configuration settings, and you're ready to go. Sample configuration of what the RSA integration would look like. Again, we've got documentation on our website that describes that walks you through how to do this. But we're also available if you have any questions or want to just guidance or hand-holding of how to do this. Please reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to help out with this. This is if you're into the technical implementation of what this looks like underneath the hood. This is how the entire workflow from user entering their credentials all the way through authentication through RSA, what it would look like. So all the communication channels in between. So that being said, I appreciate everyone's time this afternoon or this morning, or depending on where you are in the world. We're going to have a follow-up presentation or webinar to this in a couple of weeks, talking about how we detect threats. Now that you've got multi-factor authentication configured on your server and on your applications, now how do we detect the threats that could be coming in and still trying to compromise your authentication mechanism? So those brute force attacks and those dictionary attacks and those credential stuffing attacks, and how do we get visibility into those things occurring and what we can do about it? So that'll be on May 20th. So please, you'll see an email about that. Sign up. We'll try and make it very, very informative where it leads into a next webinar. So if there are any questions, feedback, comments, if you're interested in having us help you guide through this setup, please reach out to us. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on LinkedIn. You can reach us through our website, XYPRO.com, or feel free to reach out to me on my Twitter, on my LinkedIn. We're all here standing by, all ready to help. So again, I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you for joining, and I hope to see you soon on the 20th. Thank you, everyone.